You see, we want to step in our own direction, and each time we do, we are further and further from the center of where God is. So, if that's the reality of the situation, we need to be able to tell our story of failing to recognize, because it's easy for us to get separated again. But here's one of the things that I've been kind of thinking through, and that is that the stories that are the most repeated are the ones that we most remember. So like if you really wanted to think of the stories that you know and that you probably could tell, they're the ones that you have heard the most or that you have repeated the most, right? So I was thinking about things in history, and if I were to say the word Titanic, most of you probably immediately have something in your mind about what happened with the Titanic, right? You probably could tell the basic of the story and all of those sorts of things, because it is a story that has been frequently repeated. It's one that's very fascinating to some people, and there's multiple stories and things that go like that. I would guess that most of you could do that, but there are some less recognized but equally important historical events that you may or may not be aware of. For example, are you aware of the Great Emu War of 1932? Anybody? The Great Emu War of 1932. See, the story's not repeated all that much, but now I'm going to tell you, hopefully you'll tell some other people, and we'll bring awareness to this very important event. You see, after World War I in Australia, they gave the Australian veterans plots of land to begin to farm land on, and that would be a very good thing for them to do. So in Western Australia, they started clearing off land and bringing in water and planting seeds and getting the crops to grow, and everything seemed to be going pretty well until the Great Depression hit. And then there were some other issues going on in the world, and then there was the Great Emu Migration. So after breeding season, they migrated, and they came up and they found all these nice, wonderful farms that they could then just absolutely feast on. They say that there were about 20,000 emu, ostrich kind of bird that doesn't fly, that was over there, and they were just absolutely decimating the crops. So the farmers began to beg the government for assistance, and the government said, of course, we know how to handle some silly little birds that you need to get taken care of. We'll send down the military and a couple of Lewis machine guns, okay? So they send the military down there with some machine guns to take care of these emu, and they began their mission on November 1932. Now, here's the problem. Their first day was an absolute disaster because there were some things apparently they didn't know about emu, or they didn't quite plan through quite right. For one, emu can run in excess of 30 miles per hour, and they are extremely agile creatures. Then they would outsmart the soldiers by running off into groups of their own instead of standing around together, so that when the soldiers would start to take aim at them, they were kind of all over the place and couldn't be herded together to just sort of shoot them down. On top of that, you could shoot an emu several times with a Lewis machine gun, and still it will keep running and chasing and avoiding you. So apparently on the first day, which they thought this was going to be so simple, cull down the population a little bit, they might have killed about a dozen. So now you think, all right, we can be smarter than that. They mounted the machine guns to a truck. This way they would be faster and they would be able to chase those emu, and this would solve their problem. The only issue is that when you're trying to shoot a machine gun off the back of the truck at an animal that can run 30 miles an hour, which was apparently faster than the truck, and that the terrain that you're on is not quite smooth enough for you to really be able to get anything, that was an absolute, utter failure. So about a month goes by. The Australian military had managed to kill maybe a few hundred of the estimated 20,000 birds. And the military withdrew, meaning the emus defeated the Australian army. So, stories generally entertain. Stories generally impact somebody, but stories almost always serve as a call to action for you to do something with it. So, two absolutely true stories, the Titanic, which you were all very familiar with, and the Great Emu War of 1932, which apparently none of you seem to really know much about. But you have two stories that have a call to action. One, don't be overconfident when it comes to getting on a ship that you think is unsinkable. And the other, don't underestimate a flock of birds. Right? So we're going to talk a little bit about stories, and my question for us this morning is this. Why is it necessary for Christ followers to tell their story of failing to recognize? You see, we are challenged as Christians. 1 Peter 3:15 says this, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks, to give you reason for the hope that you have. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute, because once in a while, hopefully somebody's asking you, why do you have so much hope? Why are you always joyful, even in the midst of things that don't seem to be a very joyful moment? Most of us would be able to say in an instant, well, it's Jesus in my life that makes that possible. But I think here's the challenge that we face. Too often, I think we're really quick to say Jesus is the reason for my hope, but then leave it sort of hanging there. And I think what God is calling us to do is to tell more of our story and to be able to share a little bit more. And yet our problem is that I think most of us are so uncomfortable that we don't even know where to start. So I'm hoping that over the course of the next few weeks that we would be able to find a way to be prepared to tell our story and then to be challenged to go out and tell it. In fact, I'm going to challenge you, and I want you to be thinking about this now, that I'm going to ask some of you to volunteer to be on video to tell your story. Now, I'm not talking about the full-length documentary kind of thing that we did for Journey to Christmas, but I am talking about a little 3-minute kind of, this would be the story you would tell somebody if you were stuck with them for 3 minutes and wanted to give them the reason for your hope. We're going to look at a story that's most familiar to, I think, everybody in the room, but the parable of the prodigal son. Now, in that story, Jesus really kind of gives the salvation story, and kind of we can go off of that to figure out what we ought to be telling other people. Now, the parable is just a story. It's not necessarily true. Jesus doesn't say it was this kid at this place. But actually, if you didn't already know this, the parable of the prodigal son is the longest fiction story that Jesus tells in the New Testament. It's the one that he spends the most time on. So think about this. And it actually has a lot of times where it kind of combines with, or looks back to some other texts and some other sibling rivalries found in biblical texts. So we're going to read just a small portion of it today. And here we go with Luke chapter 15, 11 through 16. Jesus continued, There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything." Now, there's several things going on in this first part of the story that I really want to kind of pull out and have you see. And that is, the first one, the concept of the house of the Father is essential if we're really going to understand this story. Now, when we think of a father's house, most of us live in kind of a nuclear family, or that we've left a nuclear family and we're on our own, whatever that looks like. But when we go back to Israel and the times that Jesus was around, there were basically 3 levels of sort of relationships that people would really pay attention to. One is, what tribe are you part of? So you could be related by tribe. The next one would be sort of clan, but the most, smallest unit would be considered the house of the Father. In Hebrew, this is the Bet Av, all right? And so the smallest possible unit that there would be. Now, the house of the Father typically included the patriarch's nuclear family, but it also would include anybody who is married in, any grandchildren, anybody who's kind of been taken on along the way, plus all of the servants of the family would be considered as though they were family because they were under the protection of the Father's house. So pay close attention. We're talking about probably 50 to 100 people. And whatever house of the Father that you were part of would determine your status in society. All right, so if you were theologically, you were Israelite, and this is how you were, then because you lived in that house, you were considered that way. And if it was economic, if you were in a very wealthy house of the Father, then you would have a very high status because of your wealth. So, some of the things that you got to think about is when we talk about the Levirate law. That's the one where if a brother dies, but the brother hasn't yet had any children, no male heirs, then the brother will marry the widow in order to give that family line a male to keep it going. There's also an importance in maintaining family lands. That's something that was very important to God, so much so that he said there's going to be a year of Jubilee. Anybody remember that? And in the year of Jubilee, all things should go back to the families that originally owned them. It's a sign of the covenant with God. So keep all of this in mind as we continue down the story, because the younger son begins to be a little bit, shall we say, a problem child here. He begins a pathway to separation because he asks for his inheritance. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this, because there is no way to ask for your inheritance early that is considered nice or cool or calm or collected, I think. Because if you say to your parents, "I'd really like to have my inheritance now," what you're really telling them is one of a couple of things, and really probably both. You're taking too long to die would be one. Like, I'm getting impatient waiting for you to die so I could get on with my inheritance, which is not the correct thing to say to your parents, and even if you want your inheritance. But the other thing that you're really saying is that you are worth more to me if you were dead than you are since you are alive. There's no nice way to say this. There's no way to do this in a nice way, in a way that's good. Now, as a father, you could say, "Hey, I'm getting old, and I'm going to go ahead and divide the property up while I still have a clear mind." But when parents, fathers would do this, they would say, "All right, you get this, and you get this, and you get this, and you get this, but until I'm dead, I get the benefit of it all," right? So until it's died, you don't have really claims to it. The son begins by separating the father's wealth. Now, remember what I told you. Remember that this is a household, the house of the father. The patriarch is responsible for all of these people. And now the son comes and demands that the father's property be divided. Now, how the property is divided isn't really discussed. If we really wanted to go into depth here, we could talk about how normally the firstborn son got a double share, and so that would mean it was divided into three and he got a third. But for the purpose of what Jesus is saying, he doesn't care, right? And so I want you to keep in mind that we have no idea what he left with, but we know he leaves very wealthy, and he takes at least a third of the estate with him. The value of at least a third of the estate, which means now that family unit, that house of the father, has a third less to cover their expenses and to kind of keep them from experiencing extra loss. So he's really putting the entire house at risk. The next thing the son does is he separates himself from both his father and from his country. Now, the son takes his wealth with him, and that probably means he sold a bunch of things and some possessions and maybe some land and who knows what all else so that he could gather things together that he could take with him, not just to another neighborhood, but clear into another country. So now he is separated physically from the house of the father. He's separated individually from the house of the father. In other words, he doesn't have the same status as he once did. He's not just welcome to come for dinner without an invitation. He's no longer a resident. But he's also moving away from the family's center. He's moving away from Israel. Now, we're not told what country he moves to. Jesus didn't feel like that was important in the story, but we know he moves to another country. So now he's also a foreigner. But while he's there, the son separates himself from his inheritance. Now, think of everything that has been separated so far. He's been separated from his father. He's been made his father's wealth separated. He's been separated physically from his father and from his country. And now he goes, and it says that he squandered his wealth in wild living. Now, you know what wild living is, right? Some of you know what wild living is. Some of you have an idea of what he might have been doing. But consider things like prostitutes and whatever it took, right? Now, I'm thinking by now that if you are just a casual reader of this story, you're starting to get a little bit really irritated with this young man. You know that he's already absolutely insulted and broke his father's heart. He's moved away. He's taken all of this stuff with him. And while he's there, he squanders it all. Every one of us probably knows somebody who has been given some sort of a great blessing, like an inheritance or a bonus or something, and you watch somebody just kind of throw it all away, and you're like, are you serious? What are you thinking? What were you trying to do? And so about this point in the story, if you weren't already angry with him, now you're like, boy, this kid is so dumb. What is his issue? How did his father not teach him better? But think about it this way too. He had a responsibility to take care of his father until his father died, because that was an expectation. And now he has absolutely no means to do it with if he did want to reconcile and come back home. So you think, oh, well, things have really gotten bad now. He's poor. He ends up being also separated from his faith. We're told that there's a famine in this new country that he decided to go to, and so he's there, and now he doesn't really have anything to barter with, and so he ends up having to hire himself out as a just common laborer, perhaps. And the person that hires him says, all right, I'll hire you, and guess what? I want you to take care of the pigs. Now, if you know anything about your Jewish history, there's nothing worse than being put in charge of the pigs. Every time you see the word pigs in the New Testament, or the Old Testament for that matter, you should be going, oh no, not pigs. Because pigs make you ritually unclean. Just being near one could be a big problem. So he gets a job at the first place he can, and they say, great, take care of our pigs. Which means that he's even lost a portion of his faith identity. This younger son finally ends up hungry with absolutely no help coming. It's interesting the way the story is told, and Jesus says he's feeding these pigs, these gross, disgusting pigs that make him ritually unclean, and he's going, these pigs eat so much better than I do that I wish I could have just a little bit of what they get. Which also brings the question, well, why didn't he have a little bit of what they were eating? Now, I don't want you to get too caught up in the idea that he should have just taken some of the pods, because certainly that seems like it would be a logical step, but then you don't know if the owner of the pigs is watching and now you have stolen. You don't know some of those things, and either way, what you know is that they are not allowing this poor young man who has squandered away who knows how much money to even eat what they give their pigs. There's no help. By the way, if he really did want those particular carob or whatever pods, the ones that they normally fed to the pigs were considered to be so bitter that you would only eat them out of desperation. You would choose almost anything else before that. You'd probably go gnaw on a tree before you decided to eat those things. You see, here's the challenge that this poor young man faces. He failed to realize that he was trading security, the security that comes from being in the Father's house, for death. He couldn't see down the road far enough to go, hey, I can get my inheritance early. I can go have a wonderful, great time out doing what I want to do. But if I do that, it might ultimately lead to a place where I will no longer have anything. And I'll be starving to the point where I really don't have enough energy to keep going. Back at the house of the Father, he had everything. He had everything he could imagine. He had wealth. He had servants. He had all the food that he could ever need. He had status. He had a proper upbringing. And now he can't even find food to feed himself. Now, I don't know about you, but that's what you consider to be without any hope at all. This is not the point at which, well, things just really aren't going my way. This is the point at which things really aren't going my way, and probably thinking they never will. He has this major issue because he was sure that he could trade the security of house, the security of home, the security of being with his Father, and that when he replaced it with wealth and adventure, that he would be better off. And when he gets there, he finds out it is absolutely empty. He's ready to die. Now, were you paying attention? The beginning of this story, many of you know how the next part's going to go. But the beginning of this story is one where somebody goes from the security and the comfort of being home to going to a place where they are almost dead. And didn't even realize how he got there. So back to our question. Why is it necessary for Christ followers to tell their story of failing to recognize? See, I know that most of the time when we are reading through the story of the prodigal son, we begin to kind of read into it and recognize that we are part of that story. It's our story too, at least to some extent. I think it's right for us to do that. But I think one of the things that we sometimes sort of gloss over is that we do everything in our power to separate ourselves from God. That we tend to, even though God is constantly calling us to Him, we tend to be like toddlers who go, but I can do it myself. we don't always recognize that God is offering us something so much greater and so much more wonderful. I think sometimes we can look back and say, hey, you know what? When we thought we were doing a wonderful thing and really enjoying life, that actually what we were doing was causing damage to those around us and to ourselves as well. It's why we tend to put ourselves in the position of the prodigal son and put God in the position of the loving Father. You see, we want to step in our own direction, and each time we do, we are further and further from the center of where God is. So, if that's the reality of the situation, we need to be able to tell our story of failing to recognize, because it's easy for us to get separated again. Now, there's a double whammy. I want to make sure I'm being really clear here. Number one is when we tell people that we have been down the road and we recognize that there have been times when we have found ourselves so far away from God that we had no option but to say, Lord, not sure why I'm falling so far away from you, but let me come back to you now, if you'll have me. We find ourselves in these sorts of positions, I think actually fairly often, if we're not careful to tell the story. Remember what I told you at the beginning. The stories that we tell the most are the ones that we remember, that shape us, that make us who we are. So that we don't learn much from the great Emu War because we don't know it. Well, you do now, but that's a whole other story. You see, there's always this draw to thinking that we can do it without being a part of the family. Now, I got to tell you something. I know a lot of people, story after story after story of people who have hit rock bottom, realize that the only way to get to where they need to be is to go back to the Father. And when they get there, what ends up happening is that they don't realize that they have to stay there in order to have what they really want in life. They begin to step away again. It's almost like they didn't tell themselves this story often enough. And so this is part of what I'm trying to tell you this morning. It's easy to get separated from God, but if we will tell the story, not just to ourselves, but to others, we will be less and less prone to do the same things over and over and over and over. God will remain at the center and will realize how wonderful it was. I want you to think about this for a minute. If you were the son in this story, and I hate if anybody doesn't know the story, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert right now. You can cover your ears. He gets to come home at some point. But we don't know anything about him after that. So part of me wonders. I also think that there's something to be said about the older brother, but that's another sermon we'll do in a couple of weeks, so you're going to have to wait. One of the things that I think we sometimes lose is that in the midst of this story, there's in verse 12 a word that is translated in our NIV anyway as estate. That same Hebrew word, Greek word in that particular case, can also be translated as life or as a manner of life. So you need to be thinking of it like this. The estate is what supports all of life, all of the family life, all of the life that we get to do together. Sometimes I think we do go to God and say, look, I'd really love to have my inheritance a little bit early. I'd like to feel heaven right now and not have to wait for it. I'd like to just not have any more of the pain. I'd like to just not have any more of the struggle with temptation and all of that. And what we do is actually begin to separate ourselves more from him. The people who tell me that they're really good not going to church scare me the most. They need to be telling themselves the story of how far away from God they once were when he brought them back to him, standing there with open arms. You see, I think that this younger son fails to recognize all of that. I think we all have at some point in our life failed to recognize it. He probably rejoiced in gaining his inheritance. We probably said, oh good, we're finally free. And then it must have been really awesome for him to be able to go out and live whatever lifestyle he wanted and be totally loaded down to be able to do whatever he wanted. And sometimes I think we find ourselves in that same place. The further away I get from God, the more freedom I have. He's not watching, is he? I bet you he left for another country, for an exotic, far-off place, because it was going to be so exciting to be there. Until his personal Titanic hit the iceberg and all the money was gone. Famine came and he had to take care of nothing else but pigs. I know we're not to that part of the story yet, but could you imagine having to go back to the father? It'd be like admitting that you couldn't beat a bunch of birds at their own game. But I want you to really pay attention to this. Other people need to hear your story so that they can be pulled out of where they're at. But not only that, you need to hear the story so that you don't fall right back into where you were in the beginning. You see, if we don't tell the story of one point in which we walked away from the safety and the security of our Father's household, of God's household, other people aren't going to hear it. What's the reason for my hope? It's Jesus. People are going to look at you and go, okay, no idea what that means. Do I just need a bumper sticker for my car? If I go to church once in a while, how often do I have to go? See, the problem is that at some point, if we have given our life to Jesus Christ, we realize how far from God we had gotten. Whether intentionally or whether not intentionally, I don't think most of us at some point said, you know what? Let me see how far from God I can get. But once in a while, we've looked around and we've taken stock and we've realized that without God's presence in our life, and if we're not right there with Him, we're going to be in a world of hurts. That's the story we ought to be telling. It's a story we ought to be telling others. It's the story we ought to be telling ourselves. Because the next time we're tempted to take another step away from the family center, which is the Lord, it'll remind us that we don't want to go that far. As you tell your story, does it impact you? You see, one of the problems is most of us don't tell this story. We don't talk about this part. Some of us do, but most of us don't. We don't talk about how far away we got from God and how we realized at some point that there's a loving God standing there waiting for us. We jump right to the good news. Jesus! Because I think sometimes we don't want to realize or we don't want to tell people there was once a point where I was far away from God. How does telling your story impact you? Is it reminding you of how far away from God you've actually gotten or that you had gotten? And does it help you to stay closer now? You see, it's all about what we'll remember and what we learn from. Which story are you going to repeat? Now, I could tell you there's lots of options this morning. I gave you a few you could go out and repeat. Now that you know about the Great Emu War of 1932, don't keep it to yourself. Tell somebody. Many of you already knew the story of the prodigal son, but how often have you told it? The story I really want you to be able to tell people is the story about the time you were that prodigal son. Now, I'm going to keep following this up. I told you it's going to take a few weeks. If I preached the whole thing today, we'd have to be here a really long time, and I'd need a nap too. but this is the first part of what you should be working on. Gave you homework. You heard that, right? It's one thing that I want to make sure it's absolutely clear. Because I always realize every time I preach, there are most likely people who are listening to my voice who haven't really fully given their life to Jesus Christ. And my fear is that there are some people who would listen to this sermon and they would recognize themselves as being really far away from God and not know how to get themselves back. And I already told you how the story ends. Many of you already know how the story ends. The Father lovingly welcomes the Son back, restores him to his position, and God is doing that for us. So if you find yourself in that point today where you're feeling like you're further from God than you want to be, realize that God is always standing there calling you to himself. He's been waiting for you to come back. And all you have to do is say, I believe. Let me come back home, and you'll be back under the protection of the house of the Father. And this is also what we should be praying that we're able to communicate to those around us. So a lot to think about. Got your first of the year really started off well. But the greatest way to start it off is close to God. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much. We thank you for today. We thank you for new beginnings. We thank you that you are a God who knows the story of redemption because you're the one that created it. Lord, forgive us of our attempts to become little g gods ourselves. Forgive us of our desire to so much want to be like you that we forget that we are supposed to be your servants. Forgive us of the times when we have essentially asked you for our inheritance and said that we'd be better off without you. Forgive us of the times when we've forgotten the story altogether of how much you've done for us. Help us to not take you for granted. Help us not to ever fall back into rock bottom again where we feel so far away from you that there is no hope and we feel like there's no one there to help. Lord, for anyone who might be listening to my voice, who says that today is the day that I need to completely give myself over to the Lord and to come back into the house of the Father, may this be the moment that they choose. There's nothing special about it, Lord. Just praying, saying that I want to have that relationship with you, Lord. Let me back in, and you wrap your arms of love around them. So, Lord, give the assurance where the assurance is needed. Lord, we know that there's a celebration for everyone who comes back home. We're going to learn more about that in the coming weeks too. But Lord, we just ask that in the meantime, that you would draw us close to you and that you'd help us as we begin to tell our story of how you touched us. We pray all of this in Jesus' name.